Mark that song. I want to thank Kevin for that prayer. To preach the word with boldness. To preach the word with boldness. Well, I don't know as I necessarily fall into that category, but I'd like to. I like the idea of preaching God's word with boldness. And today I want to talk about something. It was a question I think the kids had at one time. And from time to time, maybe we all have this question. But the question has been asked, what happens to us when we die? We all experience death. We all lose loved ones. The Hebrew writer says that it is appointed unto man once to die. And so all of us, barring the Lord coming back first, all of us will experience death. And so it might enter our minds what happens to us when we die. I sat with a lady some years back. I suppose it's been probably 2.5 years now. I sat with a lady in the hospital that I knew of as Aunt Connie Cans. And I sat with her the day that she decided to have the machines shut off. She was conscious of her decision, and it was her decision to shut the ventilator machine off and to die. And she knew that that would be the outcome. Her doctors had made that abundantly clear. And I sat with her and her many nieces, and as Connie slipped from this life into the next. And it made me myself wonder, having never sat with someone who had passed before, it did make me wonder what was going on, what was happening. And some people, if you go to a funeral, I went to 2 funerals this past week, and hopefully I'm done with funerals for a while. But sometimes you'll go to a funeral and folks will talk about going directly into heaven. So-and-so is in heaven right now. Well, is that the case? Some folks will talk at a funeral about being in a deep sleep. Others might say that we simply cease to exist. But what does the Bible tell us about this? What can we learn from the inspired Word of God about what happens to us when we breathe our last? What is death? I guess that's maybe that is the question that we need to ask ourselves. What is death? Last October, we were in Indiana, and we got a phone call from Celia. My father-in-law, Steve, had passed. Very shocking. But what is death? I want you to think about this. We know from the book of Genesis, when God breathed in Genesis chapter 2 and verse 7, God breathed into man, the breath of life. And man, the King James Version says, became a living soul. When also in the book of Genesis, chapter 1, God says, let us make man in our image, after our likeness. We know that God, from John, the Gospel of John, chapter 4 and verse 24, that God is a spirit, and those that worship God must worship Him in spirit and in truth. When God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, God gave us an eternal soul. When the King James Version says a man became a living soul, man became, if you'll pardon the expression, eternal. Let's look at this. I would like to introduce the idea that death is a separation of body and soul. 2 parts. There are 2 parts to each of us. There is our soul. There's who we are. It's part of our conscious thought. It is our being. And our soul is linked for this life in a physical body. Go back into your Old Testaments with me to the book of Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes chapter 12. Solomon writes about this. Solomon is pondering in his old age. He is pondering the questions of life. And in pondering the questions of life, one must also ponder the question of death. Some people will tell you that Ecclesiastes is rather a morbid book, but I'm here to tell you this book is fascinating. For many years, the book of Ecclesiastes was my favorite Old Testament book because it answers the questions of life. What is important in life is revealed in the book of Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes chapter 12 and in verse 7, Solomon in pondering death says this. Solomon says, and the dust returns to the earth. Speaking of the physical body, the dust, man, remember in the book of Genesis chapter 1 and 2, chapter 2, man was formed out of the dust of the earth. And so when God formed man out of the dust of the earth, he took that dust, formed it, don't know how, don't know great detail, but Solomon says the dust returns to the earth and the spirit returns to God who gave it. A separation therefore occurs between the body and the soul. The instant that one ceases to breathe in life, the body begins to decay. I remember when my Grandma Anderson passed away, I was in the hospital outside of the emergency room. Sorry, not emergency room, intensive care unit, when she breathed her last. And shortly afterwards, we were allowed, my brothers and I were allowed to go in and say farewell to the body. Now, I can tell you one thing assuredly. Her body was already beginning to decay. There's no doubt in my mind. The spark of life was gone from her eyes. They had pulled the eyelids down. That was not my grandmother. It was the shell that once housed her soul, who she was. That was not my grandmother. James chapter 2, if you will, look back in the book of James in your New Testaments. James chapter 2 and verse 26. James 2:26 says, for the body apart from the spirit is dead, so also faith apart from works is dead. James is making a point based on a known fact. The body separated from the soul is dead. Now, it's important for us to acknowledge this. The medical profession has made great advances in medical science, for which I am thankful. But again, if we go back to the book of Ecclesiastes, Solomon makes it clear that no one has the power to retain the spirit. Now, I know this, it's common sense, but sometimes you don't realize how strong the will to live is until you've actually sat with someone who is dying. There are people who will go to great lengths to extend life days or even hours. In Ecclesiastes chapter 8, in verse 8, though, Solomon makes this observation. No man has power to retain the spirit. or power over the day of death. There is no discharge from war, nor will the wicked deliver those who are given to it. All this I observed while applying my heart to all that is done under the sun, when man had power over his own hurt. Solomon says, I've looked at these things. When a person is going to go, he has no power to retain the spirit. And that is different for every person who dies. My father-in-law died of a brain aneurysm very suddenly. My brother died in a tractor accident very suddenly. Other people linger for years. But in the day of death, no person has the power. I don't believe that my brother was willing to die. I don't think he wanted to die, but he had no power to retain the soul. Neither will I in the day of my death. Death, with a few exceptions, while Jesus and the apostles were on the earth, happened only once. Now, there are a couple of exceptions to that. Lazarus, Jesus raised from the dead, demonstrating his power over death. Occasionally, an apostle might raise somebody from the dead. But with those exceptions, death is a one-time occurrence. Today, without Jesus and the apostles, death is a one-time occurrence. There may be those who are dead, if you will, I'll use air quotes, legally dead on an operating table that might come back to life. But I seriously doubt that anyone has actually died a physical death. I don't want to get into someone. If someone claims they've died and come back to life, I'm not going to argue with them because I'm not who they are. However, the Hebrew writer says that death is a one-time event. Hebrews chapter 9 and in verse 27. The Hebrew writer says, and just as it is appointed for a man once to die, and after that comes the judgment. That seems pretty simple. We're appointed to death one time. There's no second chances in death. There's no opportunity to get to that moment of death and say, I forgot to turn the stove off for lunch. You're not going to have the opportunity to change something, to do something that you did not do, or to undo something that you have done. Very simple. We know scientifically the body decays. Peter makes that point, 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 24. Now, I know enough, I've had enough animals pass away that there's no doubt in my mind the human body, being as it is created, is going to decay. Solomon says it goes back to the dust of the earth. And in 1 Peter chapter 1, in verse 24, Peter says, for all flesh is grass, and it is its glory like the flower of the grass. The grass withers, the flower falls, but the word of the Lord remains forever. Peter says it's like grass. It's here, it's gone. Temporary. Body decays just like grass withers and decays. I'll make a note here before we go on any farther. We don't begin life on the earth. Let's just get that point right now. We don't begin life here on the earth, and it is not here on the earth that life ends. Life does not end in death, and life does not begin on the earth. 2 Corinthians chapter 5. Let's go to 2 Corinthians chapter 5, and in verse 5, He who has prepared for us this very thing is God, who has given us the Spirit as a guarantee. God created our souls. We may not have been conscious of such a thing. God created our souls. That soul was united with our body in our mother's womb. And our soul will continue on. Now Paul goes on here in verse 6. For we are always of good courage. We know that while we are at home in the body, we are away from the Lord. Did not Solomon say that the soul would return, or the spirit would return to God who gave it? In several passages in the New Testament, Paul references sleep when speaking of those who have died, as does Job, David, Solomon, and others. I think one of the most prominent passages is 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, where Paul talks about sleep, those who have fallen asleep. And this is probably where we get the idea of that death is like sleep. In fact, sometimes we sing a song, my life will end in deathless sleep. Well, to a point that's accurate, but don't take it too far. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and in verse 14 of that chapter, beginning in verse 13, Paul says, But we do not want you to be uninformed, brothers, about those who are asleep. In that instance, Paul is referring to those who have died, those who are asleep. Well, Paul wants us to be informed. Now, God has a place prepared. A soul without a body, I don't fully have a full grasp of the human soul. But God has a place for separated souls. I'll call them that. Departed souls, separated souls, bodiless souls. God has a particular place prepared for those souls. The Old Testament says Sheol, I think is how it's pronounced. It's a Hebrew word. And like many Hebrew words, it has multiple meanings. The word Sheol appears 31 times in the Old Testament. And it is referenced in some places as a place of eternity, or a place of torment for eternity. This would be eternal hell. Most of your translations will translate this word as hell. It also has a meaning of a place of departed souls waiting judgment. There is a separation between these two. They're not the same place, even though the same word is used. And so we have to evaluate the context in which a word is used. For example, Genesis chapter 1. The Hebrew word for day appears. And that Hebrew word has multiple meanings. I picked up a tract by the Jehovah's Witnesses, and by the way, I don't have anything against Jehovah's Witnesses necessarily, but I picked up a tract for the Jehovah's Witnesses, that talked about it was what we consider the gap theory, or a long creation. Basically, this theory was that there was an indeterminate amount of time based on the Hebrew word day. That Hebrew word day contains three meanings. It can mean daytime, meaning the sunny portion of the day. It can mean a 24-hour day, or it can mean an indeterminate period of time determined only by the context in which it's written. Now, this Jehovah's Witness tract had decided that, hey, we can fit evolution and creation in the same Bible. And they said that the word day in the book of Genesis meant an indeterminate period of time, and so therefore the world evolved slowly over this, quote, day. Now the problem with that is, the Bible clearly states in Genesis chapter 1, evening and the morning followed the first day. And so that gives us the context in which it is a 24-hour day. Sheol is like that. Yeah, it may be used, and we have to evaluate the context in which it is used to find out if it is eternal hell or if it is a place for departed souls. A temporary waiting place, I might say. And so the context, before I click my button too soon, but before we go on, let's look at the book of Psalms for a moment. Psalm 16, for example. Psalm 16, and let's look at verse 10. Again, our focus is not on eternal hell, but our focus is on the place of departed souls. And in Psalm 16, verse 10, David writes, "For you will not abandon my soul to Sheol, or let your Holy One see corruption." David is saying that his soul is not going, of course this is a prophetic psalm, but I think David is using this in two terms, both his personal soul, but also the soul of Jesus. He says, you are not going to allow my eternal soul to remain in Sheol. Therefore, we can come to the conclusion that since hell is eternal, this then is the Sheol reference for a waiting place. Now, the book of Acts chapter 2. Let's go back here because I believe it's used again here in the book of Acts, chapter 2. I think this is referenced here. Acts chapter 2 and verse 31. And Luke records for us, Acts 2:31 says, "For he foresaw and spoke about the resurrection of Christ, that he was not abandoning to Hades, nor did his flesh see corruption." Now I want to introduce you to that New Testament word Hades. Luke is quoting from Psalm 16 verse 10. Only he uses the Greek word Hades. Hades is also a place of departed souls. Hades is never used for eternal hell. Gehenna is the term that is used in the New Testament for eternal hell, if my memory is correct. Hades is not. Hades is a waiting place for souls awaiting judgment. Temporary place. The Bible doesn't give us a lot of information on Hades or Sheol. I'll call it Hades for our sake because I believe it's easier for us to wrap our minds around a word that's only used for one specific application. But the Bible doesn't give us a lot of details. So there's some gray area here, but we'll look at what we have. The word Hades is found 9 or 10 times. There is some question about Matthew chapter 16, verse 18 in the original text, what the original text was. However, 9 or 10 times in the New Testament. Most simply refer to Hades as a place, making reference to its existence. They don't give us a description, much like Acts chapter 2 and what we read there a moment ago. Peter tells us that Jesus' soul went to Hades before his body was raised there in Acts chapter 2, verse 31. We're not going to go back there. Also, Psalm 16, verse 10. We looked at both of those passages that tell us that Jesus' body, or Jesus' soul, went to Hades. So you know what that means? That means Jesus died. That means there was a separation. His soul departed from his body. His body was then laid in the tomb. He was dead. All over. Dead. In the book of Revelation, because of what was prophesied by David, or God through the mouth of David, maybe that'd be a better way to look at that. Jesus overcame death. Jesus controls Hades. In fact, Revelation chapter 1, verse 18, John says, as he's quoting Jesus, begin in verse 17 with me so we get the context. When I saw him, I fell at his feet and as though dead, not that John is dead, but he laid his right hand on me, saying, fear not, I am the first and the last, and the living one. I died, and behold, I am alive forevermore. I have the keys. I have the keys of death and Hades. Jesus has the key. I find that just so fascinating. Jesus has the key. The most vivid description that you can find of Hades appears in Luke chapter 16. We'll go back there very quickly. I'm not going to spend a great deal of time trying to describe a place that we really have little description of. So I will read you the text, and you can determine for yourself. Luke chapter 16, and I believe this is an account. Some folks will argue that this is a parable, and if it is a parable, it does not change the meaning of the parable, but I believe this passage is a direct account. Luke 16, begin with me in verse 19. There was a rich man who was clothed in purple and fine linen, and who feasted sumptuously every day. At his gate was laid a poor man named Lazarus, covered in sores, who desired to be fed with what fell from the rich man's table. Moreover, even the dogs came and licked his sores. The poor man died and was carried by the angels to Abraham's side. The rich man also died and was buried, and in Hades, being in torment, he lifted up his eyes. Now both are in Hades. You'll notice that Abraham also is here. The poor man, though, is by Abraham's side. And he called out, Father Abraham, have mercy on me, and send Lazarus to dip the end of his finger in water and cool my tongue. For I am in anguish in these flames. But Abraham said, Child, remember that you in your lifetime received your good things, and Lazarus in like manner bad things. But now he is comforted, and you are in anguish. And besides all this, between us and you is a great chasm, which has been fixed, in order that those who would pass from here to you are not able, and none may cross from there to us. And he said, Then I beg you, Father, send him to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers, so that he may warn them, lest they come to this place of torment. But Abraham said, they have Moses and the prophets. Let them hear them. He said, no, Father Abraham, but if one goes to them from the dead, they will repent. He said to them, if they do not hear Moses and the prophets, neither will they be convinced if someone should rise from the dead. Okay, so just basically I want you to think of this as two-part section. There is a part of Hades that is comfortable. There is a part of Hades that is uncomfortable. Very uncomfortable. And there is a partition, chasm, void, canyon between the two sections. We can have that in mind. I think that's pretty well fixed. I also think that we can read more into this than what the text actually has. So again, we need to be cautious. Bible scholars and Christians have disputed this passage. I said that I believe it is a parable, or not a parable, but reality. There's been debate about that. But this we know. There are two parts, like I mentioned. One of torment, the other of rest and peace. We know that a person's soul cannot pass from one part to the other. The rich man was afraid for his loved ones. This tells me there's a consciousness to the soul. This tells me that he is aware. He may not, Hollywood depicts sometimes those who have died looking down from heaven. Friends, I don't think that's the case. There is a consciousness, but I don't believe that there's any indication here that the rich man was looking at his family, seeing what they were doing. Maybe there is, but I would be afraid to lead too much into that. But he is aware that they are not there. They are not in Hades or Sheol. I think here's the reason that I don't think that the rich man has consciousness of earthly events. It comes from the book of Ecclesiastes chapter 9. And again, maybe I'm wrong on this, maybe I'm reading too much into this, but I remember an old Bing Crosby movie where I think it was an aunt who had passed away. She would sometimes appear in the corner of the television screen and say something to one of her nephews that was left living, Bing Crosby and Bob Hood. Those two were made a wonderful television couple. But they got this part wrong. Sometimes she'd send out a little bolt of lightning to motivate one of them. But Solomon in Ecclesiastes chapter 9 and verse 10 says this. Solomon says, let's actually back up here to verse 9. Enjoy life with the wife whom you love, all the days of your vain life that he has given you under the sun, because that is your portion in life, and in the toil at which you toil under the sun. Enjoy what you do. Enjoy the people you're with. Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with might. He says this is the point. For there is no work or thought or knowledge or wisdom in Sheol to which you are going. There is no work. There is no earthly work. There is no earthly thought or knowledge or wisdom. Jesus makes it clear there is a consciousness and there is a concern. The great thing is, Hades is not a permanent place. Jesus will open Hades at the end of time Revelation chapter 1 verse 18, we referenced that. He has the keys already. As the Son of God, Jesus has the authority over death. Let's look at the Gospel of John chapter 5. Gospel of John chapter 5 and in verse 25. John's Gospel says this. John says, "Truly, truly," this is Jesus speaking, "I say to you, the hour is coming and is now when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear will live. As the Father has life in himself, so he has granted the Son also to have life in himself. And he has given him authority to execute judgment because he is the Son of Man. Do not marvel at this, for an hour is coming when all who are in the tombs, all who are dead is what he's saying, all who are dead and buried, decayed. You think it's the bones that's going to hear his voice? No. It's the souls. He says, in the tombs will hear his voice and come out. Those who have done good to the resurrection of life, and those who have done evil to the resurrection of judgment. The great thing is, when that souls come out, for time's sake, I'm not going to go back. Well, yes, I will. The great thing is, those who come out of of Hades, those souls will receive a new body. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 50. The Apostle Paul says, "I tell you this, brothers, flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God, nor does the perishable inherit the imperishable. Behold, I tell you a mystery." There's that word mystery again. Remember I said in Bible class this morning that the Bible is so exciting to me because it's like a mystery book. And I get excited when I study the Bible because I'm trying to figure it all out. He said, "Behold, I show you a mystery. We shall not all sleep, but we shall be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trump. For the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised imperishable, and we shall be changed. This perishable body must put on the imperishable, and this mortal body must put on immortality. When the perishable puts on the imperishable, and the mortal puts on the immortality, then shall come to pass the saying that is written, Death is swallowed up in victory. O death, where is your victory? O death, where is your sting?" Departed souls. Jesus said they would rise to judgment. Revelation chapter 20 makes that clear. We're going to rise to judgment. Those who are judgment. And it's not just judgment for necessarily everyone. Jesus in John chapter 5. Hold on. Let's look what Jesus said. Let's back up just a moment. Make a point. John chapter 5, if we back up to that section we read there in verse 25. I want to make a point. I hadn't planned on this. Let's back up here. John chapter 5, verse 25. Find my place. Actually, let's go down to verse 28. Do not marvel at this, for an hour is coming when all who are in the tombs will hear his voice and come out. Those who have done good to the resurrection of life, and those who have done evil to the resurrection of judgment. You see, it's already there. Those who have lived a life according to the will of God, they don't need to be judged. Their life is already there. Look here in the book of Revelation. Revelation chapter 20. See, these are those who have been obedient to the gospel of Christ. It says in Revelation chapter 20, verse 12, I saw the dead, small and great, stand before the throne, and the books were open. Another book was opened, which is the book of life, and the dead were judged by what was written in the books according to what they had done. Remember Romans chapter 3. All have sinned and come short of the glory of God. Verse 23. Paul says Jesus died on the cross to take away our sins. There's a book of life, he says. We're going to be judged by what's written in the book. The sea gave up the dead which were in it, and death and Hades gave up the dead who were in them. And they were judged each one according to what they had done. And death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. This is the second death. The lake of fire, this is eternal hell. This is Gehenna. Hades will be destroyed. The dwelling place, temporary dwelling place of the soul, will be destroyed. Judgment is the last thing that one who has died will have to endure before the determination of the final fate of the soul. Revelation 20. Let's back at Revelation 20, verse 15. And anyone's name who was not found written in the book of life was thrown into the lake of fire. Now, read verse 1 of chapter 21. And I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven, from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people. You see, when Jesus left his disciples, he said, I go to prepare a place for you. This is where God was preparing a place for his disciples and for us. God himself will be with them and be as their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. And death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain any more, for the former things are passed away. What can we take away from this very quickly? I'm not going to go to these references for time's sake. Be holy. To be holy means to be set apart for the work of God. Death is not something to be feared for the one who has lived a life according to the Scriptures. Paul himself looked forward to his death. He said that he was stuck between two. To live was better for his fellow Christians, and to die meant that he would be with the Lord. Friends, there's only one way to heaven. That's through obedience to the will of God. Obedience to what he has said must be done. You'll take out your song books and turn to 454.